This talk will seem ethereal and big think, and then I'll try to get into some very practical design advice as quickly as possible. Scott asked me to talk about the state of the industry. The title in the program is Games of Global Democracy, and we refined that a little bit to this idea of farming and fishermen, and what I believe and what we believe at Kabam is the future of free-to-play. But let's start with a quick premise of where the state of free-to-play is. I've been in free-to-play for about 5 years. Hi, everybody. Raise your hand if you're also in free-to-play. Yes? Okay. So if you've probably learned one thing from talking to your peers who are not in free-to-play or look at the press, it's that free-to-play is bad. It's terrible. You can look at all of the quotes in the press, et cetera, over the years. Free-to-play is a lie. Free-to-play tars the entire industry. It's actually called addict to play. I, as somebody who is a creative person with a creative soul, as you know, I like to sing Broadway tunes, find this to be disturbing. And I often wonder, are they actually right about that? Is free-to-play fundamentally bad? Well, I obviously reject the notion, having been in it for 5 years. And I want to talk a little bit about why, and also talk about how we got to that impression and what we are doing to change it and what we all should and can do to change it and why that's actually good business. I'll start with a story about why mobile free-to-play is, in my view, the most exciting opportunity in the world. This is the ruins at a place called Ollantaytambo in Peru. This is an old palace. It was there about 500 years ago. There is a market at the foot of these ruins that's been there for about 500 years where the descendants of the Inca sell wares, clothes, handmade Peruvian caps. And I was walking through this marketplace and I saw this particular cap sitting out there in the market. Now, I don't know much about human culture, but if you're getting your IP made for a mobile phone, knitted into a cap by the descendants of the Inca and sold in a marketplace that's 500 years old, you've probably made it, right? The point is that mobile has an ability to reach people on a global scale that games have never experienced before. The stats and the reason why should be inherently obvious, but for those who don't know, this curve shows how smartphones and smart devices have been developing over the years. At this point, there's about 2.5 billion smart devices in the world. They easily eclipse PCs. And the most interesting stat for me is that over 70% of the world's population is currently in ready reach of 3G at all times. To put that into context, that's a greater portion of the human population with access to 3G than have reliable access to running water. So the information revolution is here, duh, you all know this, but this gives some numbers to it, right? This is what the opportunity is in mobile, and this is what the opportunity is in free-to-play. Now, free-to-play is particularly important because devices have now reached every corner of the globe, and for that, I'll tell a different story. My wife's an international human rights attorney. She hunts down people who've committed war crimes and atrocities. You may have heard a story recently about a former Somali general who is a security guard at Dulles Airport. This picture is from when she was working on the investigation of that case. They dug up a mass grave of people who'd been killed by this general, and they were reconsecrating the grave. The man in the center there is the head sheikh of Somaliland. And my wife was fortunate enough to be there and to take this picture, which she posted to Facebook. And immediately upon posting this picture, several people from Somaliland saw it, liked it, commented on it on their smartphones. And I tell you that because within context, one should recognize that Somaliland and Somalia is probably one of the most destroyed places on earth, next to perhaps Afghanistan. And that country, Somaliland in particular, which was the northern former colony of Britain, has rebuilt itself, and everyone there now has a smartphone. They have entirely skipped televisions, they have entirely skipped landlines, they have entirely skipped broadband. They will never have those things. They will never play a video game console except for in a very few small number of houses. But absolutely everybody in that country has a smartphone, and everybody has access to internet through that smartphone. And All of that is a wind up to something that I wrote about a week and a half ago, which should at this point be inherently obvious to everybody in this room, because within the last week and a half we've had the global phenomenon of Pokemon Go. Games are now able to reach an absurd number of people, and they're able to do so instantly in a way that games have never been able to do before. And that is the power of free-to-play. The folks here were never, ever going to buy a $60 game on top of a $400 console, on top of a $2,000 television, on top of a $100 a month broadband connection. So why does free-to-play work, and what's so great about it, particularly within this context? Well, this is probably old news to most of the people here. This is the economic model of free-to-play, but if it's not old news, I'll walk you through it briefly. This is called the surplus value curve. Essentially, when you're looking at any audience, on the left-hand side, you see how much people in that audience would be willing to spend for a product, and on the right-hand side, you have the number of people. So basically, you can look at this curve and understand that there's a very small number of people who would pay almost limitlessly for a product that they really like, and an enormous number of people who pay very little. And the traditional games model of capping at $60 sort of misses all the money that these people would spend and misses all the money that these people would spend. And so the reason why free-to-play is amazing is that it enables the small number of people to spend a lot more, and it enables all the people who wouldn't spend a lot to spend a little and still enjoy the game. And it also enables people to play completely for free. This is what has unlocked the possibility for games that are given away for free to make so much money. But for a second, let's forget about spending and talk about engagement. How do people engage with a game? On what curve does their engagement fall? So I've looked at dozens and dozens of games over years of playing it, and the shape of the curve of the way people engage with a product is completely different. Or when I say that, I mean exactly identical. People engage with a product that is free to play with unlimited engagement in the exact same curve. Now, there's an important difference, which is up here at the top. That's 24 hours. Due to the frail limitations of we weak humans, nobody can actually engage with a game for more than 24 hours a day. We can all accept this as a true premise, yes? But there is a small number of people you will find in any game that you're running that's free to play who are engaging with a game 6, 10, 14, 20 hours a day, literally 20 hours a day. Netflix at one point released, when they first released a new season of, I believe it was the Kevin Spacey series, that somebody had just sat and watched it all the way through in one sitting. That's one person, right? That's the person who's at the very top of the curve. And then there's a lot of people who are on the lower half of the curve, people who engage for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, et cetera. Now, why this is important and why it's interesting, and this gets into the practical design implications, is that there are people who are in the Venn diagram overlap of these two, and there's people who aren't. So for instance, in this group of people who are engaging incredibly heavily up here at the top, some of them are also the people who are spending incredibly heavily, and some of them are people who aren't spending at all. And when you think about a community of people playing a game, these people share a perception of the game despite their differences in spending patterns. They talk to each other constantly. So I'll try to imagine this. If you're interacting with a system 16 hours a day, the people you're most likely to interact with during that 16 hours a day are the other people who are interacting with it 16 hours a day. The people who are interacting with it 5 minutes a day, they will be barely a blip. You will not notice them. And if you're interacting with a system 10, 15 minutes a day, you will hardly get to know these people, and you'll have a completely different perception of the game. And this becomes true across game designs and systems. So what happens is a game, a free-to-play game, ultimately starts dividing into basically the 1% and the 99%. And as you interact with your communities, the 1% has a very different perception of the game, either through spending or through engagement, than the 99%. And they don't always share common cause. And when you're designing the game, you may have systems, you may have UI, you may have all kinds of things that are really privileging the 99%, that annoy the hell out of the 1%, and vice versa. And you have to think about them in those terms. I'll give you a very simple example. You have a piece of text that comes up to remind you how something works. Because people, when they don't play the game regularly enough, they constantly forget, oh yeah, that's the button that does the thing, right? Well, if you play the game 16 hours a day, every time you see that piece of text and every time you see that button, it's incredibly irritating. It's annoying, right? And so building a game that can adjust the way that it interacts with you based on your engagement level becomes an important enterprise. Now, these 1% folks, when it comes to engagement, are essentially your most critical players. And they are not necessarily your biggest spenders. When you think back to those quotes about why people think free-to-play is terrible, why in fact people would call free-to-play games the worst games ever, et cetera. It's because in the early days of free-to-play, when you think about that surplus value curve that I showed you with the top spenders, when you think about it from a monetization perspective, there was an early misconception in free-to-play that this was essentially a limited amount of potential revenue, right? Let's say you look at a game and you'd say, okay, this game can ever make $500 million. We have these people over here on the left, they will ever spend $10,000 a piece, we can multiply that out, et cetera. And I don't know if anybody else was in a room with this, I was regularly in rooms where somebody would say, we're extracting money, right? This was an idea, this is the way we think about it. We're extracting money from the audience by building the systems that will get that $500 million out as quickly as possible. And this led to an enormous alienating impact on the players of the game. Rather than thinking of your game as essentially extractive, and rather than thinking about a game as privileging only the people who can spend the most, the whale hunting that we talk about, if you shift your focus in making these games towards the people who are engaged the most, you find that you've got a very different group of people. Yes, you have the very high spenders, but you also have people who are able to engage quite endlessly, but will never spend money, but have a huge influence on the game. My favorite example is that Mike Verdu, my co-president at Kabam, has been in an alliance for many years in a game with a Malaysian fisherman. He is the guild leader, and he organizes what everybody does. He's never spent a penny in the game, but he's incredibly important to all the other members of the alliance who do spend. And these, because their engagement is so deep, they actually make common cause to each other. Across our games, we find very different people than what you would think of as the sort of typical whale, as the people who are most engaged in our games. And the more we target them and make a game that's welcoming to them to engage deeply, the stronger our games end up being. Several other examples from Kabam Games. In one of our games, one of our top players is actually a military officer who's deployed abroad, who views the game as the only way that he can own and control something of his own. He spends so much time working on other things. We have members who live in incredibly rural areas, and the games are their primary social contact. If we move away from an extraction-based perspective on games, how do we get as much money as possible out of them as quickly as possible, and more towards the ability of thinking about how you foster connections with your players for a very long time and create a social game that privileges engagement as much as it privileges spend, you're able to build a game that lasts much longer than you ever would have predicted. And the best example, one of the best examples on the marketplace is Clash of Clans. Clash of Clans has now grossed over $5 billion. There is nobody in this room, I can guarantee it, who knew when Clash of Clans first hit the market that it would gross $5 billion. And it's because they built a game that constantly keeps social connection privileged over just the highest spending. This mechanism of thinking about games shifts our perspective from being essentially a extractor, a driller, a miner, to being a farmer. You're building a game that has constant interaction with your players that can last for years and years and years. And I want to talk about some practical ways that we've done this in Contest of Champions, which as of today, I could not possibly predict how big Contest of Champions will be. The way forward to building these kinds of games, and this is why I think free-to-play games will be the future for a very long time, will last for decades. Some key pillars. First, your team has to make a game that you love. This seems like it's obvious, but I assure you from having talked to many people who've worked in free-to-play and have made games that it is not obvious and is not always the case. If you are succeeding in this game, you will be working on it for 10 years. If you do not love it, you will not continue to make it great. Technical excellence turns out to be unbelievably critical. You will lose the most people, the most engaged customers, not from a bad piece of system design, not from charging too much, not from anything else. When you look back over the years, the places where you'll have lost the most of your most important customers will be when you had a server outage. 100% of the time, always true. So making sure that you are privileging technology first and foremost in your design, being very thoughtful about how and when you do updates becomes absolutely critical to build an engagement that lasts for a very, very long time. The next one, I'll get to this in just a second with a nice chart, is think in your design about how time invested can equal money invested. And I'll give you some more examples of that. If you've got a design where essentially only spending matters, you will actually break your game and it will be impossible for it to last for a very long time. Build systems that foster long-term connections with the game, but also between the players. Your players are going to do the best job of keeping people in the game for a very, very long time. And finally, keep giving players something new. At Kabam, we talk about this as putting on a show. Every single day, there should be something different in your game. I hear this said in speeches a lot. I've heard it over the past 5 years. However, I've then been in the room where people are presenting the design and talking about the game, and the first question somebody asks is, how will this feature or this new piece of content alter ARPU? Right? It is, I guarantee you, executive knuckleheads like me always ask that question. The truth is, just putting on the show, doing something different has its own value. It keeps people engaged with the system. It is necessary. You do not have to think about how every single piece of content that you do will incrementally impact ARPU, and in fact, that thinking can be destructive to long-term engagement. So I said, think about how time is equal to money. Boiling down a lot of what I was just talking about, this for me is a sort of a critical design grid when we think about systems at Kabam. This is a grid of your players. There are some players who have a lot of time that they can invest in your game. There's some players who have absolutely no time that they can invest in your game. And there's some players who have a lot of money they can invest, and some who have absolutely no money that you can invest. And for a long time, the systems designs in free-to-play, and the ones that have led to people feeling like free-to-play games were exploitative, were built in such a way that they only privileged the people in the upper right quadrant. The people both who had time to commit to the game and who had money. And when you examine the much more sophisticated Asian games that have been running free-to-play for over a decade, there's a whole different set of systems in those games. Yes, it is true that these people who we would traditionally call the whales, right, the people who have time and money, have a really great advantage in the game. But all of the systems are built so that the people who have time and no money, and the people who have money and no time, end up being able to be in competition or in cooperation with each other. And when you go into your guilds, when you look at them at a deep level, when you're running one of these games for a long time, you will see that there's guilds where at the very top, there's people who have a lot of time and a lot of money who are just winning, right? But then you have multiple guilds made up of people who are sort of collaborations of these two groups. And I'll give you some examples from some of our games. It is critical that this secondary mechanic exists. If you do not have these people pressuring the people at the top, they will get bored with the game. Does that make sense? Right? If you do not have people who are essentially nipping at the heels of the most engaged, highest spending players, the most engaged, highest spending players will go, okay, well, I've won this game, I'm done. So building a game where the folks who have not a penny to invest and will never invest have the ability to play very deeply and engage with the players who have money and no time is actually really critical to keep the game's ecosystem healthy. An example of this that was a little painful, but I think was really important to us, was a key bit of learning for us in our game, The Hobbit. We had a period with The Hobbit where some of our players came to us and started complaining to us about our customer service. And the players who were complaining to us were actually our highest spenders, and they weren't complaining about their customer service. What they were complaining to us about was their alliance members who didn't spend were not getting good enough customer service. Right? They banded together with their alliance members to push us towards treating their alliance members better. The future of free-to-play games are that they will be deeply social. People will be interacting with each other from across the globe. Malaysian fishermen will be interacting with people from Bel Air, right? And they will get to know each other, and they'll get to know each other very well, and they will stand up for each other, and it is your job to create an environment in which they are able to play together and enjoy that time. That was a key lesson we learned there. Another one learned almost by accident is in our Underworld Empire game, our Castle Age game from Phoenix Age. These games at their deepest level are incredibly social and incredibly competitive. They have a mode called Empire versus Empire, where the top players fight against each other. The highest spending player in any of these games, the game is designed in such a way that literally that player cannot ever win by themselves. It is impossible. They have to have an alliance of people to fight with. And those people don't even have to be that powerful. And these games have been operating for 4 years, so in the case of Underworld Empire, and 7 years in the case of Castle Age, with a completely rock-solid, steady group of players. Like, there's almost no attrition. And what we find is that group of players who are still in the game are 50-50 people who have spent money and people who've never spent anything. Right? People who've played for 7 years in Castle Age who've never spent anything, because they're constantly engaging in this social gameplay where they have a meaningful and important role. In Marvel Contest of Champions, what we found is in our early game, there was very little social interaction between the players. And then soon after launching the game, we added guilds, which allowed players to actually work together. And immediately our LTV jumped up, like significantly and measurably jumped up. And then we added a system called Alliance versus Alliance, or Alliance versus Enemy, where the players all were able to band together and go against a boss. And by adding that, again, our LTV jumped up and doubled. Not just with new cohorts, but with all cohorts. That every time we added a deeply social system, while we did not see our ARPU immediately change, that was actually a really key element. While we did not see our ARPU immediately change, over time, we saw players spending and spending and continuing to engage with the game far longer than we'd originally anticipated, and thus our LTV grew and grew and grew, well past what we could have ever anticipated when we launched the game. Creating these deep social systems where players can band together is absolutely critical. And with that, I think I've got questions and I'm out of slides. So, yeah.
Can you go into a little more detail about your learnings from going into China with Contest?
Sure.
And kind of catering to that spender or not? Yeah.
So the China one, we're still in the middle of it, so it's hard for me to give you very clear learnings. We're about 6 to 7 weeks in now. So first off, IPs, I guess a key learning for anybody who wants to work with a brand is that IPs are radically different in various countries. This seems like it should be a knuckleheaded thing, right? But it will baffle people every time. So for instance, with Marvel, when we first deployed it in our betas, the numbers weren't actually that strong. And we first deployed in Denmark and Sweden. And we later learned that the Marvel IP isn't really big in Denmark and Sweden. It's like a very distinct group of hardcore fans, and then it's not really that popular. And then once we went to Canada, it was huge, right? In China, we're finding that the ways in which people interact, while the Marvel IP is huge through the movies, the way people interact with the IP is very different than the way they interact with it in the West. So in the West, people have a sense of the large character roster. In China, it's entirely about what movie characters are popular, and that's what people privilege and what they're interested in collecting in the game. But beyond that, because the players have a very deep sense of how games that involve collecting characters work, as opposed to Western consumers, because they've been playing games like that for a decade, they immediately apply all of their sense from every other RPG with collecting of characters onto our game. They're like, well, wait a minute, that's not how those systems are supposed to work. They're supposed to work like this, right? The best example I can give, when we were sort of thinking about this in a design meeting, is think about if you took the very popular Chinese first-person shooter Crossfire and released it on Xbox One here in the United States, right? If you've ever played Crossfire, people will be like, what? That's not a first-person shooter, right? And so a lot of our early challenges with the game were people going, well, wait a minute, that's not the way that those systems are supposed to work. So we've been modifying the systems to further make them what the Chinese consumers expect, though that had been entirely our process to get it to China, was to culturalize it to make it more like a Chinese game. It's a very challenging problem set. And the truth is, because China is such a big market, everybody's thinking about it as specific to China, but you could literally culturalize in almost every country on the globe, because countries have different relationships to IP and different relationships to game design mechanics. Hope that gave you some detail.
I didn't realize that that question would take us out of time, and I really wish I'd asked him to sing the answers, but everybody, please give it up for the one, the only, Aaron Loeb.
Thank you.